today I'm talking to Nick Acheson from Norfolk, who is a very, very talented and experienced conservationist, leader of wildlife tours, author, and speaker at Global Bird Fair. Nick, thanks for joining us.
I suspect I've given more talks at Bird Fair than anybody else ever, because I used to do 12, when I used to travel a lot, I used to do 12 talks at Bird Fair for Nature Trek mostly. So I don't think anyone else, and that was for about 10 years, and I still do. I've just written down, I've got, different events at this year's Bird Fair. I think I've done more individual appearances at Bird Fair than anybody else ever, probably.
For the sake of viewers, people who will be listening to this, why don't we start off by you sharing some of your backstory and who are you, what you're all about, and what can people look forward to?
My name is Nick Acheson. I was born in North Norfolk, which is where I live again today. But after my 2 degrees, I moved to South America. I went 3 months on a project to Bolivia and ended up coming home 10 years later. So a big part of my life was lived in Spanish, in South America, in Bolivia, where all my writing and thinking and all my work and things were done in Spanish. And so I feel very at home in Bolivia. Then while I was living in Bolivia, I started being asked to lead nature tours and sort of expanded until I was leading them all over the world. And when I came back to the UK, I was asked to carry on leading all over the world. But when I came back, I started working for Norfolk Wildlife Trust, which has always been an organization very close to my heart. And I still work for Norfolk Wildlife Trust part-time today. I'm an ambassador for Norfolk Wildlife Trust, but I'm also heavily involved in lots of other things. I'm chair of trustees of an organization called Deepdale Conservation Trust, which is where we breed the corncrakes, which are for the English Reintroduction Program. We also Head Start curlews. These are eggs that are doomed to be destroyed on Ministry of Defence airfields, and we give them a chance at life. And this year we've got a dozen of our previous curlews paired up with wild curlews in Norfolk. So it's definitely working, or in East Anglia, that is. It's definitely working. And I'm a patron of a small volunteer conservation organization called Selbert Trust, and I do lots and lots of things for nature and for people's relationship with nature. I gave up flying about 6 years ago, so I still lead tours, but they're all British-based nowadays.
Okay, well, fascinating. Yes, I know the addiction of immersion overseas in amazing things, because I somewhat in parallel had Africa do the same to me. I traveled expecting to be away for a year, and 30 years later, I still haven't come.
30 years, wow, that's pretty amazing. And it's hard to make that decision, isn't it? I gave a talk about Adam Neal, which is BirdLife International's partner in Bolivia, a couple of nights ago, and someone asked, "Why on earth did you come back?" And there's a whole range of reasons in life that make you think, is this the rest of my life? Is this where I live for the whole of my life?
It does get you like that, doesn't it?
But it does change things. You look on things with a perspective you can't understand unless you can visit places. You can go for a month, you can go for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. It doesn't change you in the way that living in a place for a decade does.
But don't you find that knowing what incredible diversity and just sheer amazing nature is out there helps you appreciate what we've got in the UK even better?
Absolutely so. But it also changes your perspective on the struggles that the cultures that live alongside these species, this biodiversity, these landscapes. You have a much keener, it's very easy from our privileged position in the global north to go, oh, but they should ... when in fact we've absolutely raped and pillaged our biodiversity to the nth degree. There's nothing left. And we have we killed off anything remotely dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
And we have no right to judge people who live, in many cases, in abject poverty.
Yeah.
So it changes perspectives on everything. But yes, and just before we started, I was taking photographs in my garden of Cyber selenitica, a tiny little hoverfly, and a beautiful little Osmia bee, and I appreciate everything from the teeniest lichen to the most magnificent rhinoceros.
Yes, absolutely. Do you still have swallowtails in Norfolk?
We do. I saw them last week. I saw one last week. I was leading a birding and nature watching tour. And of course, swallowtail in May and June is a big target for people. But it was during those days of powerful north winds. And I was really rather fearful that we wouldn't see a swallowtail. But happily, we did see a swallowtail, a fresh one that landed right beside us to feed from a yellow flag iris. So that was rather lovely.
Yeah, super. Back in my youth, I used to go photographing them up to your knees in muck and bullets, as they say, or wading through the swamps.
But if you didn't grow up squelching through places and climbing trees and things like that, then what on earth were you doing with your life?
Quite right. Absolutely. Let's not go there. But you're right. And I believe you're a bit of an author as well. Tell us about that.
Yes, I have 2 books coming out next year, both of them in partnership with other organizations. And then I have my first solo author book. I've contributed to lots, but the first one I've solo authored came out a couple of years ago called The Meaning of Geese, which is about the lockdowns of the COVID winter. And I cycled during that time 1,200 miles on my mother's 42-year-old bicycle. And I followed the whole winter the flocks of largely pig-footed and dark-bellied Brent geese that come to Norfolk, and told the story of them from the perspective of the many people whose lives they touch here in Norfolk and on their migrations back to the Arctic. And then I've got 2 books next year. One I'm speaking about actually at Bird Fair. One's a partnership with the Society of Wildlife Artists. They have a residency over the next year in Norfolk. They started early this month. 18 of their wonderful artists came to stay on Massingham Heath, which is a biodiversity restoration project here in North Norfolk, owned by a friend of mine, a lifelong friend of mine, Ollie Burbeck, who realized that the land couldn't make a profit no matter how much his family had been throwing agrochemicals at it. It was still just a big pile of drought-ridden sand that wasn't going to make him a profit. And so he allowed it to become, with the help of a lot of experts and with harvesting local seeds from wild native sources, all under license, of course, he's restored something like the chalk and acid grassland that was on the heath prior to Dick for Britain and the Second World War. And it's just phenomenal. And the Society of Wildlife Artists, helped by an incredible team of local volunteers, are coming for a whole year. And they're producing a book of their phenomenal art. And already the work that's been produced from the first residency is just jaw-dropping. And I have the privilege of writing the story.
Oh, fantastic.
Of the heath and its wildlife and the artist's interaction with it. And so it's just been the most beautiful, joyful thing for the last few weeks.
Yes, coming back to your meaning of geese at the COVID era, it's quite incredible. I find that so many people have positive reminiscence of those COVID lockdowns because of nature. I remember I was living in the Peak District at the time, and so while everybody else was being turned away, go back home, we could just set off across the river and up in the hills, and nobody would even know about it. And watching curlews in the meadow that you'd never seen before, watching a dipper feeding its young in the river. It was a magical time in that sense.
It was the spring lockdown was, and the weather was so lovely. Yeah. I had a white-tailed eagle fly over my garden. I sat out one evening listening to the common scoters migrating that winter off the west coast and fly to Siberia. And I remember one night I walked out and I went listening for little owls and tawny owls and barn owls and walked for miles and miles and miles. And every day I'd get up at 5 o'clock. I remember a badger trotting past my front door at 5 in the morning. It was magical. The second lockdowns, the winter lockdowns, were a lot harder. And that was when I took to my bike because I didn't have an income, for all sorts of reasons, family sensitivity and things. I didn't have people around me. So I'd been very alone and very isolated and very short of money for a year. And I thought, right, you've got to do something to get this. And that was the genesis of the book. And it itself has been a wonderfully positive thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So Norfolk obviously has a bit of a pride of place when it comes to conservation, rewilding, and just the sheer diversity. Um, what's your take on the state of conservation, both worldwide as well as in your local area?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. So, just to jump slightly sideways and bring you to the other book that I've got coming out next year, because it is directly relevant. What Norfolk Wildlife Trust is 100 years old next year.
All right.
And I have written articles for Norfolk Wildlife Trust for 15 years. And so, with a local publisher, we're bringing out a book which tells the story of Norfolk Wildlife Trust through 15 years of my articles. Because I've covered more or less everything we've done for the last 15 years, including when we were 90 years old, when we had a big celebration and I wrote the history of Wildlife Trust and things. So I've got a pretty good feel for where we are. It's two stories at the same time. The landscape is catastrophically impoverished. There's no doubting it, that since the First World War, then particularly the Second World War, our destruction of the landscape. We can be polite or diplomatic about it as much as we like, but land management, and that means farming, without pointing the finger of blame at any individual farmer, not saying any individual farmer wanted to screw nature, but nonetheless, we have destroyed everything.
Yeah.
And we're now in a situation where we've got these tiny pockets left. So that's one side of the equation, and it's very much the bigger side of the equation. But on the other hand, organizations like Norfolk Wildlife Trust, which is the one that's probably closest to my heart, are more ambitious, more driven, more professional, more absolutely set on turning things around than I've ever witnessed before. So there are glimmers of light in a very, very dark situation. And the thing most people don't sort of get their heads around globally is that we are still destroying habitat, Southeast Asian rainforests, coral reefs, Amazonian rainforests at an absolutely alarming rate. And not just those pinnacle environments that everyone's heard of, but globally, biodiverse ecosystems around the world are still being destroyed. We are still chopping them down, burning them. And we are still, and I don't understand how this is possible for an ape that claims, that has named itself Sapiens, we're still burning more fossil fuels every year than any previous year of our existence. So there's this big story about climate change and net zero and 1.5 degrees. And we're likely within the next 5 years to be permanently committed to above 1.5 degrees. And the catastrophe for biodiversity, if one looks at it dispassionately without involving humans, the catastrophe for biodiversity, it's all very well saying, oh, well, the Serengeti's safe, it's a national park. But if the climate changes so radical as it will that none of those species can survive there, then you've still lost absolutely everything, which is why I gave up flying. So to be honest, it's pretty hard to be optimistic as a conservationist because it's all over.
Yeah. Literally, in both meanings of the sense, it's all over, but it's all over.
Yeah, absolutely. It is everywhere, the problem. And we are reaching the end game.
Yeah.
And then following on from what I said about biodiversity, if we think that human problems are bad now, when vast areas of the world, the Gangetic Plain, where most of India's population lives, and there are, 1 billion people in India, when the Gangetic Plain becomes literally uninhabited because it is too hot, and when vast areas of the central belt of Africa become literally 50 degrees and above constantly, then the problems we have with resource scarcity, migration, refugees are going to be exponentially greater than they are today.
Yeah.
And yet we still plow on with this. And we've got a bloke in the White House who thinks there isn't a problem.
And yeah, just this week, an entire Swiss village gets eliminated by a glacial melt avalanche. And people are still saying, no, it's all fake.
Yeah, absolutely. And entire ecosystems. I was writing something earlier this year about the Himalayas, and essentially every Himalayan ecosystem depends on the seasonal snowmelt. But and again, that population, 750 million people, 500 million people who live essentially along the Ganges, they depend on the snowmelt. That's where the water comes from. And when the glaciers have gone, there'll be no snowmelt. And to me, climate change is the biggest problem that biodiversity faces, but it's quite obviously also the biggest problem that that global human societies face.
Yeah.
Well, isn't this a cheerful conversation?
Well, no, but the positive side of it is that we can get joy and relief from nature that is still there. And let's face it, you know as well as I do, Nick, nature is a survival mechanism for life. And if it needs to cast off humans, it will just do that.
Yes, it will. And eventually, yes, it will. And I have Tim Appleton asked me if I would chair a panel on nature and mental health this year at Bird Fair. And several people are contributing to that. Sean McCormack, Lucy Lapwing, and LK, and forgive me, she was added later on, and I don't remember the name of the extraordinary woman who is from BirdLife Israel, who is contributing, who has done a great deal of work around mental health, working with people in the field, really taken action on this subject. And I hope she'll forgive me that I never having met her, I hope she'll forgive me, I don't remember her name.
Sure.
But we're talking about nature, about all of these issues. I haven't yet prepared a line of questioning, but we'll be talking about ecosystem grief and how as Aldo Leopold says, the benefit of an ecological education is to live alone in a world of wounds. Very, very easy to become depressed on account of nature. But then, as you say, just the simple fact, my little daily meditation of walking around the garden with my phone, taking photos of Cyber Selenica, I'm completely separate from all of the world's problems for that small moment. I'm enchanted by this glorious organism that may well be a migrant from the Mediterranean, this tiny thing that may have flown here on southern winds from the Mediterranean. And then there's the sense of agency that comes from doing something. We may, and in a sense, it's the string quartet on the Titanic, but at least while you're going down, you know that you're doing something that makes the world around you a little bit better. And everything we do that in some way influences the world around us in a positive way is still a good thing to do.
Well, compared with the alternative, of course it is.
Yeah, with the alternative, absolutely. My retired GP dad, when I asked him, who's well in his 80s, and I asked him how he is, and he says, well, it's better than the alternative. And that's the attitude we have to take with biodiversity. And biodiversity will recover if it does, as you say, shed the toxic skin of humanity. I despair when I hear the Elon Musks of this world talking about colonizing other planets. I'm thinking, I want to use words I can't use on the Global Bird Fair podcast, but we've messed up this planet to such an extent. Can we not look at ourselves and think maybe other planets might be better off without us?
Well, that's for sure. And it'll be easier and cheaper to put this one right than to do anything on Mars.
Absolutely. And we are the textbook definition of a pest.
Yes.
But it takes a certain amount of humility and self-knowledge to be able to admit that, because we're programmed by a whole range of different things, a lot of it sort of Judeo-Christianity and its philosophical take on the world, with no disrespect whatsoever to anyone's beliefs. We have been taught this way of seeing ourselves as the center of the world, the universe, and what we do is inherently right and righteous, when in fact we're the ones that have screwed everything up.
Another positive take on it is I'm sensing, and people who attend events like the Global Bird Fair are absolutely the core of this movement of people who recognize and enjoy the value of nature in all its forms. That is a still enormously growing movement, and paradoxically in Britain, which is so nature depleted, we are still a nation of nature lovers. So that's really positive. And the nonsense in the world will pass, probably quite painfully, but the
I think there's no
will
probably
go.
about it. And there's another really lovely thing specifically about Global Bird Fair, actually, that it has become much more diverse in its way of approaching nature. That a few years ago, Old Birds Fair was very much about a very male, a very white, a very traditional way of looking at birds. And now there's a much younger, more diverse, more radical, more free-thinking group of people for whom Bird Fair is a really important event in their year. And they're there singing a different song. They're there celebrating nature right across the spectrum of humanity, but also right across the spectrum of biodiversity, that you don't necessarily need to be able to tell an eastern from a western subalpine warbler from without tail feathers, but you can look at the butterfly and gasp at the sheer wonder of it.
Yeah.
And that's a valid approach to loving nature too. And Global Bird Fair has got very much better at welcoming people from all backgrounds, and saying everyone's relationship with nature is equally valid.
And from all over the world. I mean, literally all points of the planet is extraordinary in that sense. And not just birds, of course. I mean, if you want to hear about birds or lynxes or ocelots or whatever, I mean, it's a festival of nature, I like to think it of. And it's, as Tim Appleton says, it's become one of the biggest conservation events in the world.
It has. And as you say, there are people there singing the song of nature from every country on Earth, pretty much. And you can look from the tiniest aspect of biodiversity to the most grandiose cycle of the migration of the wildebeest across the Mara or whatever. It's all there.
So you mentioned that you're hosting the nature and mental health panel. You're talking about your book. What else are you doing at the Bird Fair?
I'm very lucky to be sponsored by Viking Optical. He says, glancing over at his wonderful Osprey binoculars. And I'm leading a couple of walks for Osprey from their stand on the Friday and Saturday mornings. I'm speaking slightly on the fringes, but Global Bird Fair is so big, it has fringe events. I'm speaking about having lived in Bolivia for 10 years, and I regularly give a talk that intends to raise money for Armonía, which is BirdLife International's partner in Bolivia. And I'm giving that talk at the Near Tropical Bird Club AGM, which I think is on the Saturday evening. I'll know when I'm there. And the trouble with Bird Fair for me is that I give talks on so many different subjects and I never remember what I'm supposed to be saying. I'm giving a talk, as you mentioned, with the Society of Wildlife Artists, with Harriet Mead.
Yeah.
I'm contributing to the podcast, which is the Countryfile podcast. I think that's on a Sunday. I'm giving a talk for the company I work with, Wildlife Worldwide, on a new trip that I'm doing with my friend Michael Warren, which is it's sort of a writing retreat on Isla in winter.
Oh, nice.
Michael has an amazing book coming out in about a week's time. Yeah, in a week's time, called The Cuckoo's Lee. Michael is a scholar of Saxon, England and English, and has written a book about our deep relationship with birds and place, and how birds are markers of place in our culture, and how many place names around the country bear deep relationships with birds, and how we still respond to place in the birds that we see, how we expect to see particular things in particular places, and how their presence or absence affects us. It's an absolutely stunningly beautiful book. And so Michael and I are leading a new trip to Isla in the winter, I guess this coming next winter, but I'm really not sure how bad. But we're leading a retreat. So Isla is full of geese in the winter, and I have a certain trajectory writing about geese, and it's full of eagles. And Michael has a certain trajectory writing particularly about Isla and its eagles and relationship with place. So we're leading a sort of nature writing retreat for Wildlife Worldwide, and we're giving a talk on that. So I have a very busy bird.
And
I'm
that's
getting a lot of ball.
presumably it's only coincidence that there are at least, what, 8, if not more, distilleries on Isla?
Well, I'm teetotal, but Michael is he's also a qualified chef. He's a really ridiculously talented chap. And he has a very keen taste for Isla whiskey and has a daughter named Isla with a Y on the end for that very same reason. So he's been going there for years and years and years.
Wonderful. Well, that sounds like an amazing event. But we'll look forward to all of your activities at the Bird Fair. I'm sure people will love to join in those. So, Nick, let me say thank you very much for your time. And we look forward to crossing paths at the Global Bird Fair in July, if not before.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's been a real pleasure.